Hey there, welcome to the Literary Escapes podcast. I'm Becky, and I'm glad you're here today. If you're a fan of books that give you an escape or let you explore other cultures, then you're definitely in the right place. So I'm glad you've joined us today. Stick around, we've got a great author interview for you, so let's jump right in. Yay! So, ladies, we have Marjan Kamali. Am I pronouncing your name right? I should have asked that before we jumped in, and I apologize.
No, that's totally fine. Yeah.
Yay! This has been. Let me grab my book here. This has been one of our favorite books this year.
Wow.
One of our favorite books that we've read, and I really want to go read your first one now. So. Are they connected or not?
No, they're not. And
okay.
Thank you for having me, Becky, and everybody for coming. This is such a thrill. The two books are not connected. So Together Tea is a mother-daughter story. It's about a mother so obsessed with math, she makes spreadsheets in Excel to find her daughter the perfect husband.
That sounds like something I'd do, to be honest.
Honestly, I'm on the verge of doing that myself. When I wrote it, it was many, many years ago. I wrote it as a farce, like the mother character was a little farcical. And over the years, I've turned into her. So I am so ready to make spreadsheets. I even told my daughter, and she said, "Okay, do it."
That's so funny. That's so funny.
But they're not connected. No.
Okay. So before we jump into all the book stuff, so you were born in Turkey, but your parents are Iranian, and you grew up in Turkey and Kenya and Germany and Iran, and then moved to the U.S.
Yes.
That's
research. Usually people get it wrong. That's exactly right.
That is quite a international childhood.
Yes, it's a very international childhood. My dad was a diplomat, so when I was born, they were living in Turkey. Both my parents are Iranian, but I was born in Turkey, and we moved every few years. So I'd lived in Turkey, Iran, Germany, Kenya, and the US by the time I was 11.
Wow, that's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot. Wow. I was curious about the timing of all of that. If your parents had left because of like one of the upheavals in Iran, but it doesn't sound like that's the case necessarily.
No, I mean, my parents were overseas as part of my dad's career, so they didn't leave because of the upheaval. But the 1979 revolution, which is why we have most of the Iranian Americans we have today, is because of that revolution. They came after that, and the war with Iran. We were actually overseas when it happened, and we were one of the few people who went back after the revolution because some of you may remember that time. At the beginning, no one knew how bad it would get. So it was considered a hopeful event. The dictator was out, the Shah of Iran was out.
Right.
And so we went back.
But then the Ayatollah came in, right?
Yeah. Except it wasn't at the time predictable.
Okay.
We didn't know that it would become so fundamentalist so fast. Yeah. So then we left again.
Okay. How interesting. So having grown up like that, did you ever really feel like you belonged anywhere?
I didn't. I really tried. I mean, you can imagine. I wanted so badly to belong. Every time I've been in Iran, because I lived there between ages 2 and 5, and then again 9 to almost 11. And throughout my life, I've visited. Every time I'm in Iran, I'm the outsider. I'm the foreigner.
Exactly.
I'm the American. Yeah. And then in America,
you're not American, quote unquote.
Yeah, like people think of me as Iranian. And then as an adult too, Becky, like part of what you said about the countries I lived in, I also as an adult lived in Australia and Switzerland.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I've always felt like an outsider. But at the same time, I feel like it's a privilege, obviously, to have had this expansive experience. And I've grown to embrace my outsider status because I think it gives me a perspective that's definitely helped me as a writer.
Yes, definitely. I felt like some of your characters, while they were Iranian growing up and living in Iran, they kind of felt like outsiders a little bit. I was, like Rami, she fit all the right things, but she thought a little differently. And, so I was thinking about that this morning, wondering if because of your childhood, if that influences your characters, which I would think that it'd have to, I don't know.
It truly does. I mean, every character in the stationery shop is made up, but at the same time, I think when authors say that their characters have nothing to do with them or their lives, they're lying, like maybe even to themselves. You always include parts of yourself, and
How can you not?
how can you not, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just natural. And you include maybe composites or elements of people you know.
That would make sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
How interesting. Yeah. That's really curious. So how did you become a writer?
Well, as you mentioned, I moved a lot. So I was always trying to find a sense of home, but I didn't find it in a place. I found it in reading. So wherever we were, as soon as I learned to read in Nairobi, Kenya. And I remember the moment it was a Richard Scarry book and I made out the word. And I was
how fun.
excited. And I ran to my mom who was in the kitchen and I said, "This says barber." And she like jumped up and down with me. But that was the beginning of a love affair. So I was always reading and in my mind admiring what those writers could do. And then when we moved back to Iran, as I was mentioning, right after the revolution, which was a very strange time to move back to the country in absolute turmoil. The war started after we moved back in the summer, and by September, Saddam Hussein had invaded Iran. And I don't know if any of you remember that war, but it was an 8-year war between Iran and its neighbor, Iraq. And so I was there for the first year and a half, and we would go to the basement for the bombs. And my mom, because like any good mom, tried to sort of distract us from the reality of what we were living in. So she had stocked the basement with a lot of board games and books. And the books she had in English were all these classic British paperbacks, like the little penguin. Yeah.
Okay.
And I spoke English. I read English because we had lived in Kenya, which was a ex-British colony. So my sister, my oldest sister, in her attempt to make me, not lose my English, would make me read those books and write book reports. But that's when I realized I wanted to be a writer, because I was so impressed by those authors and their ability to transport you.
That's awesome. I love that. And so did you write when you were younger, or did you like go into it after another career, or how did that go?
I always wrote. I wrote bad poems. I wrote short stories. When we moved to the US, I moved to New York City, into Queens. And I remember one of my triumphs was in 6th grade. I wrote a play that my teacher had the class perform. I always wrote, but I never thought it could be a vocation for me, because I was the children of immigrants and it was expected that we become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. Those were the 3 options available to us. And it was very important that we rebuild some sense of financial stability in this country. Because my parents had lost so much. And a writer, sad to say, it's not the surest way.
Yeah, you don't go into it to become rich, I would assume.
You do not do it for that reason. And you don't do it for any kind of steadiness. But you know what? It was always there. And eventually I just pursued my dreams after many a detour.
That's neat. Okay. And so how did you wind up in the New England area?
The same way I've wound up in so many areas. First, as a child, it was because of my dad's job. Then after I got married for my husband's job.
Okay.
So I've been the trailing spouse for a majority of my adulthood. So we came to the Boston area because my husband got a job here, and we had been living previous to that in Australia. So
Wow.
I moved to the Boston area 15 years ago, which is the longest I've lived anywhere in my whole life.
I would imagine. Yeah. Wow. That's crazy. Huh.
Yeah. And
Wow.
ironically, I live where the American Revolution began, so I think it's poetic, and it's a beautiful sort of historic town. So I feel very connected to the history.
I bet. That's really interesting. Huh. In each month, we read two different books that are set in the same location. And so our other book this month was a memoir, and the author, it was in the 70s during the takeover by the Ayatollah, and she was imprisoned as a 16 years old for being a political prisoner kind of thing. And so we learned a little bit about that time frame from that book, which is interesting that you were living there then. That's kind of hard to even imagine.
It was a very traumatic time in the country's history, and for everyone who experienced it.
Yeah. And how old were you during that time?
When the revolution happened in 1979, I was 8. I wasn't there. I went back after I turned 9. So I went back when the revolution was less than a year old.
Okay.
I mean, the aftermath.
You might have noticed some of the educational changes that had taken place at school.
Absolutely. It's ironic. Like, I look back now, and I was there for all the transitions. So when my sister and I entered Iran after, the revolution in 1980, we were walking around in mini skirts and our summer dresses. And then while we were there, the laws changed, and they made all women, and by women, I mean anybody above the age of 9, have to cover up head to toe. Though in Iran, the face is always visible, so that's a difference. But yeah, it all changed. And then the books changed, literally, like they changed the textbooks. So they changed the picture of the Shah from the first page of every textbook was gone. We had a picture of the Ayatollah. And in my first book, Together Tea, it is semi-autobiographical.
Okay.
So I cover that time period, and I cover a lot of what we experienced in the schools.
Okay. Because how interesting.
Yeah. We were asked to chant certain things. We had to pray. It truly was a religious fundamentalist takeover, and they changed all the laws. Yeah. And no one thought it could happen. That's the other thing that is scary. No one thought it could happen in Iran, because up until then it had been so close to the US and very westernized. And then,
that's what it sounded like. So that's interesting. So I don't know if when did this book come out, and when did you write it?
So the Stationery Shop was published in June of 2019. That's when the hardcover came out. Okay. And then the paperback came out in February of 2020, right before the pandemic.
So you would have been writing it like 2018.
It took me 2.5 years to write the first draft, and then an additional year to revise. So I wrote it starting in 2015. Okay. And I finished it in 2018. Yeah.
Okay. We've been reading some books lately, and I don't know if it's because of the times we've been living through the last few years, or just because we're noticing it more. But it seems like there's kind of a grief/healing theme that has been going through a lot of the books that we've read. And I was curious about, like, the timing that you wrote it versus maybe the timing that we read it. And was that intentional, or?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is the first time anybody's mentioned to me the grief/healing theme as a whole, like within the conversation of other books. It certainly was true for my book. I was writing it literally during the 2015/2016 presidential campaign in the US. So when I was writing it, this country felt very divided. And we all remember that was a contentious, kind of difficult campaign, right? First of all, it was never ending. And it just was uncomfortable. Certain things, if you were a woman, like things came out. So I wrote this book, The Stationery Shop, as an escape from all of that. And yet, of course, I pursued grief and healing. So how interesting that other books written around that time also explored these themes. I think that's very interesting.
And they come out in different ways. The grief of losing a child was in this one, and it was in one of the other ones that we read, and how the main character how the character dealt with that through their life. And just so interesting to see, how authors weave that in so beautifully. Because I'm guessing that everybody here has been touched in the last couple of years, if not throughout your life, but at the very least the last couple of years, you've been touched by someone who has been through something, because it's almost impossible to have not gotten out of the last couple of years unscathed in some manner, so.
Yeah, I think for the nation as a whole, they've been a bit traumatic. Even if you weren't touched by it directly, it's not nice to know how divided we are.
Yeah. And even, like the pandemic, which is part of the division, obviously in our country, there's been so many people that have died or gotten sick or have repercussions from it. It's just hard to have not been touched by grief, it feels like.
And it's interesting to think of the books that, as you say, were being written around 2018. We were all, as authors, informed, obviously, by what was going on in our own country.
At that point, yeah.
Yeah, and no matter how we translated that, some of those themes come out. But I'm curious to see a couple of years from now, the next crop of books.
I know, I'm curious. It's funny because I heard somebody, they did a book review on Amazon about a book that they read that was set in 2020, excuse me. And the reviewer was rather scathing in the fact that the pandemic wasn't mentioned. And it's like, so that was written, 2018, something like that. And I'm not a fortune to, I'm not, so people are kind of funny with all of that.
We'll see what happens, because I think with the 1918 flu, one repercussion was artists decided not to talk about it.
Wow.
There was almost like a lack of it in the culture. And part of that, I think, is because it was so traumatic and people were so sick of it and wanted not to be reminded of it.
Yeah.
And we're doing that again. Like if you watch television shows or certain films, they are pretending it doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Nobody's wearing masks, and that's not our reality, but they don't want to touch it.
Yeah,
yet.
Exactly. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that changes, but totally. We noticed, because we have people that live in different countries in our book club, we noticed that the title of the book is different in different countries. How does that happen? Or we had some guesses, but
well, here's how it happens. In North America, so in the United States and Canada, it's called The Stationery Shop. When the UK was buying it, because those rights are different, separate from North America, Simon & Schuster UK insisted on calling it The Stationery Shop of Tehran. And I said no, mostly because I thought, why have different titles, even in English, right? Like that's so inconsistent. But they felt very strongly that for their audience, for their market, a sense of place was key. So they talked about, the beekeeper of Aleppo, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
They convinced me, let's put it that way.
Okay.
And so in the UK, it's called the Stationery Shop of Tehran. And that's also the Indian market, which is huge. This book is so big in India. I never would have expected that.
How interesting.
Yeah. All my readers in the UK, in India, in a lot of the British Commonwealth countries, it's the Stationery Shop of Tehran. I believe it is.
Elena is in the Netherlands, and she got that copy of it. So.
Okay, so in the Netherlands, I have behind me some of the foreign editions. In the Netherlands, it's Der Boekhandel van Tehran. So it's, I think, the bookshop owner of Tehran.
I did read it in English, but I'm sure it's called in Dutch, the Boekhandelaar of Tehran. I'm sure that's the name.
Yes, that is the name. And it has obviously a different cover. Every country has a different cover. If I were to tell you some of the foreign editions that are not in English, what some of the titles are, you would be so surprised. Yeah. In Poland, it's called The Scent of Saffron.
How curious.
That has nothing to do with this.
That has nothing to do.
But again, they said for our audience, they associate that with Iran.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah. And it's out in Israel, it's out in Turkey, it's out in so many languages that just blow me away. So they all have their own titles.
Do your books get translated into Iranian? Do they go into that market?
So the Stationery Shop has been translated into Persian, and here's the thing with that is so many books published in the US get translated into Persian and get sold in Iran, but because of the sanctions, it can't be done in the official manner that the other translations are done. For every other country, there's a contract that we sign, there's official terms. With Iran, because of the sanctions, we can't do any of that, but they go ahead and they translate. So it's like they just kind of do it.
Kind of piracy almost?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah. And that it is in Iran now. It's in Persian. Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that because on the one hand, it feels like piracy. Right. On the other hand, I'm glad that, the people there can read it because the people there are not responsible for the absurdity of the piracy and all of that.
The rules and exactly. How interesting. Wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the book, you have a quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald. They slipped briskly into an intimacy from which they never recovered, which I thought was really perfect for the book. And I was curious, is that one that you chose or did the publisher find it or?
No, I chose it. I chose both the epigraphs because I read that sentence from F. Scott Fitzgerald and I remember thinking, that's the next book.
Wow.
That encapsulates the next book. I read it.
So did you find the quote prior to writing it or after you had? Okay. Wow. Okay.
Prior to writing it, but in that stage of time when I'd started to think about the next book. So my mind was open.
It was already percolating. Yeah.
Yes.
How interesting. Exactly. I love that. Okay. Because I've not paid that much attention to the quotes at the beginning or anything like that typically. But when I was going back through it, I'm like,
over them.
Well, now I'm going to have to, I'm going to have to now. So I love that. And like I said, I just thought that was perfect. So settings, you obviously use Iran has been a big one for you. California, New England. I don't know the first book, but I think it's similar-ish settings, correct?
Similar setting. First of all, I always do dual settings because or more, because I can't stay in one place. I wonder why. Like if I
Yeah,
had
exactly.
an analyst. Yeah. So I can never be in one location alone for these books. The first book is set in Iran and New York City
Okay. Okay. Nice.
because it's semi-autobiographical. Because I
That's where you've been.
immigrated
Yeah.
to New York. Yeah. Yeah.
So are you've been to a lot of other places. Are they going to be cropping up in some of your future books potentially?
I hope so. I really do, because even though I obviously feel a connection to and fascination with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason I do, quite frankly, is because I wasn't there, because my
Mm-hmm.
parents grew up there, and the country they grew up in is so different
Not
from
even
the
there
country
anymore,
today.
almost. Yeah.
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 So of course I'm fascinated by the
Mhm.
country they grew up in, which is why I set my books in the past. But I am connected personally to Australia and to some of the other countries I've lived in. I hope I can in the future. I would love to,
That would be
especially
cool. Yeah.
Australia.
That
Yeah.
would be neat. Yeah. Are your parents in Iran still or?
No, no, no. My
Okay.
parents, so we left when I was
Okay.
almost
In the 70s. Okay.
early 80s,
Early 80s. Okay.
and then they're still in Queens in New York City.
Okay. Okay. Nice.
Yeah.
That's close enough, huh?
Oh yeah, I'm there a lot. I'm
I
there a lot.
bet. Yeah. That's probably a train ride, pretty easy. So
Yeah, it's not far from Boston. It's about
good.
4 hours. Yeah.
That's not bad. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
nice. Okay. I was curious about that one too. Just
Yeah.
that would be hard if they were still overseas,
Oh yeah.
in some
That'd
of
be very
that. So
difficult. Yeah.
yeah. So what are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on the third novel, which is currently called Novel 3.
That's a clever title.
That's a great title. And after I finished the Stationery Shop, I swore that I would write a book next that wouldn't span so many decades, because as you all know, the Stationery Shop spans 60 years, and that was kind of hard to do in 2 countries. So I said, okay, the next book is going to take place like in 1 year, maybe 1 month even, and it's going to be in one place. So of course the next book takes place over 40 years, and
You're getting better.
better. Yeah, it started off 70. I shortened it, but yeah, and it's Iran and the US yet again.
Again,
So
okay.
this time it's a friendship story, and I don't know if you know this, but I write a lot of the first draft of each book by hand. I mean, you can imagine if I wrote a book called The Stationery Shop, I'm a fan of stationery. I love stationery. And I'm old school. Like I love to write by hand. So I literally have inkwells on my desk.
Oh,
This
cool.
is the desk from which I write the books. And then for each book, I have a notebook. So it's all here because this is where I work. This is the notebook for the third book. It's got little
Awesome.
stickers.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I've started, but I'm in those early stages where it's just like lots of scribbles, and
Yeah.
we'll see
I like writing by hand as well. It's there's something about the connection between the brain and the hand.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I believe it creates a different texture in the writing.
Yeah, it's very different than just typing on a keyboard or even speaking. It's different connections in the brain. So
very true.
Yeah, very cool. And so this one is a book about friendships set in
Iran and the US yet again.
Okay.
My mom keeps saying, when are you going to stop writing about Iran? It's just,
what's the year time frame in the Iranian part?
This one, they're children in the 50s, and then they're young women in the 60s, and then it takes up to the 70s. So 50s, 60s, and 70s, which honestly, 20th century Iran to me is very fascinating because the country changed so much. It became so modern and Western, and then it had this huge backlash with the revolution. Yeah. But leading up to that, it's fascinating to see how those changes affected women particularly. They were so fast paced.
Well, and yeah, there, I mean, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, while women over here were, not allowed to vote, not allowed, there was so many, you weren't allowed to have a credit card. I don't think, that kind of stuff. I don't know. It almost feels like women in Iran were already beyond that kind of stuff, maybe. But then we kind of flip flopped, and
yeah. They had the right to vote pretty early for, I guess, a country in that region, but really any country. They had the right to vote before women in Switzerland did. But then they progressed so fast, and quite frankly, my opinion is there was a backlash because certain people, particularly in my opinion, men, didn't like it. And then
the folks who are in power, they don't want to lose their power. And we've run into that in this country, as you have seen. So
yeah. And I think for me, what fascinates me is how you can make so much progress but lose it. You can lose it. And I think there was a sense of complacency in the cities in Iran. I'm not saying everywhere, not the villages, but in the cities with the professional classes who were educated. They couldn't imagine that they would go backward so fast, but they did. Yeah.
How frightening.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the other book that we read, as soon as she was able to get out of prison and then get out of Iran, she wound up getting eventually to Canada and stayed there. And
Iranians in Canada.
And just so curious and so sad that that's kind of how it has to be for so many. And
a lot of people didn't want to leave.
I would imagine. I mean, that would be hard.
It wasn't like a delightful choice. It was just the circumstances became, most people I know left because they wanted their children not to, to have the opportunities. And it's the opposite of the trajectory you're used to, where my mother had more rights as a girl and a young woman than I would have had,
That would have been hard to watch.
Yeah, it's very disheartening. What was the name of that book, if you remembered?
It's The Prisoner of Tehran.
Oh, okay. I'll look that up.
Her name is Marina Nemat, Nemat. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but
no, that's a popular last name.
Okay.
I'll look it up.
It was a really good book. I was a little nervous to recommend it for our book club because I try to find books that are, if not a happy ending, at least hopeful. I don't want, there's so many book clubs, the books they choose are, like the literary fictions, and they just gut you as, they just leave you. They're very depressing, I don't like that. I don't want to read that. And so we don't do that. And so I was a little nervous about The Prisoner of Tehran. Just the name of it was
that is the name. Oh, so another of Tehran. Yeah.
Exactly. But it was a really, really good book.
Well, I will look that up. And a lot of books written about Iran tend to be heavy and tend to focus on the trauma, which is why in Together Team, my first book is considered like kind of a comedy. And yet there's revolution and war. And I'm very proud of it because it's considered more lighthearted and funny and fun. And I did it on purpose because I was so tired of the books about Iran being heavy. But then in Stationery Shop's pretty darn heavy. So I did it myself.
Well, but it's hard, I mean, there's some countries that, in what I do, it's hard to find books that are lighter, that are set in certain countries. And so I was grateful to find even the Stationery Shop. I mean, for the topic that it is, it was a great book. And it always felt hopeful. So
Yeah, I wanted it to be hopeful and I wanted it to be healing
Mhm.
because Roya goes through healing.
Yeah.
So ideally, it would be slightly cathartic. Even not at all Iran related is the fact that she had this unfinished business with a person from her past that
Yeah.
had been haunting her. And she gets the gift so many of us don't get, which is she gets to be with him and have a sense of closure and
Right.
healing.
Yeah. Leslie says it was such a great book, beautifully written. Yeah.
Thank you, Leslie.
It was lovely. We were concerned about the ending, about how you were going to go with it. And I think everybody was like, they were pleased with how you did the ending. So well done.
Good. Were you worried that Roya would leave Walter?
I was. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was.
I hear you. I didn't want her to leave Walter because
Yeah. And even though Walter's not the love of her life, he was also the man that was in her life. So
yeah, and I think it's easy for Roya to idealize this relationship from when she was
Mhm.
so very young, particularly because it was interrupted. And who's to
Mhm.
say what would have happened if they stayed together? It wouldn't have
Exactly.
had idealistic. Yeah.
Right. Right.
And I think she loves Walter very much. And Walter loves her, but it's just different. We have maybe different loves that come
Mhm.
into our life at different stages.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as you mature, you want and need different things in life, and out of love and out of your partner, maybe. And it seems
Yeah.
like, her relationship with Baman, is that how you say it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was very kind of roller coastery, almost very emotional. And
It was very emotional. So it was exciting, but incredibly chaotic in a way. And I really wanted to explore mental illness, and Bahman's mother would have always been in their relationship, for better or for worse. Perhaps not through any quote unquote fault of her own, but that was something that definitely got in the way, and had they stayed together would always be present.
would always have been there. Yeah.
Mhm.
That's hearing her backstory was just that was such a twist. I've told this group before that, it's hard to surprise me a whole lot in books, and I love it when an author can surprise me. So thank
I'm
you
so
for
glad I did.
you definitely did. And it was so interesting, the different paths that you went down and where your mind went with the story. It was so clever and interesting and well put together. So that was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, her character is, in a way, my favorite character to write because she took over. She started off as the archetype of a mean mother-in-law, the stereotype,
Right.
overly possessive of her son, thinking he walks on water. There's a lot of Iranian mothers like that, let me tell you, who are obsessed with their sons. And as I wrote her, though, I realized I don't want her to be that stereotype. I want more depth to her. And then as her backstory developed, for me too, as a writer, I realized I really want to explore mental illness, because I think it's on a spectrum where the people who have a mental illness, they're diagnosed, they're treated. And then on the other end, there are people who are very high functioning, but they suffer from a condition that is not diagnosed and may certainly not treated at that time in Iran. And it causes such great harm to the people they love and to themselves.
Yeah.
And it's so sad.
Yeah, it was such an interesting, she wound up becoming a really interesting character. And it sounds like you're more of a plot plotter versus a pantster versus a plotter. Is that?
I'm a pantser versus a plotter. So a lot of that first draft is written by the seat of my pants.
Okay.
And the first draft is written that way. But then it's almost like I switch personalities. And when I go into a revision, I become plotter. And then it's very meticulous. I want it to be tightly woven and for it all to kind of make sense. So I change the order of things a lot. But the first draft, heaven help us, because most days it's like, I don't know what's going to happen. No clue.
Where are we going today? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so funny. And it takes how long to typically write that first draft?
Well, for the Stationery Shop and for this third book, it's about 2.5 years.
Wow,
for the first draft, 2.5 years. We won't even talk about together tea. I mean, you're going to be, honestly, you're going to be shocked that first draft took me 10 years.
Oh, okay.
Now, in the meantime, I took 6 years off entirely. So I feel I shouldn't count those because I had kids and I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the first draft, let's say now, takes 2.5 years. And then I really take my time with revision. It's another year. And sometimes I know that frustrates people in the industry who are waiting for something from me.
Yeah.
But you know what? I'm
do
such
what
a
you do.
perfectionist. Yeah, I just want it to be cooked. I don't want to send it out too soon, and I fuss over it a ton, and it takes a while. I'm slow. It takes a long time.
That's okay. Well, the end result seems to be worth it. So
yeah. And then, once it's done, there it is. Like, then I don't get to go back and
you don't get to do anything to it. Once it's done, it's done. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how much influence does like the publisher, editor, or whomever have in changes that are made?
Typically when you're being published by the big five, so in the United States, we're down to 5 publishers, big publishers, and then they each have many, many imprints.
Yeah.
And soon it may be 4, because Simon & Schuster, rumor has it, is going to be sold to Penguin Random House.
Wow.
When you are in the big 5, which I am, you have an agent. And so the first draft typically goes to your agent. Your agent chimes in with some notes, and you may or may not agree. So, sometimes I agree with certain things. I'm like, you're right. Yeah, that makes sense. Other times I'll push back. I'll say, nope, she's not going to have another daughter. Nope. Yeah. And then once the book is sold to a publishing house, there's an editor there, and then your editor also chimes in and might make not just tiny edits like, oh, you said very too much, but they might make more big picture comments. Like with my first book, the editor had a 5-page scene where the 2 young people were against a tree, and she said, you need to make that 15 pages long. Slow it down. So that's a challenge. You have to things like that. Or I had a lot of stuff where my main character was traveling throughout Iran and going to its famous cities like Isfahan and Shiraz. And let's face it, it was based on my own travels. So I went on. And then she said, we don't need 60 pages of that. So you get told things like that.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. It's got to be hard when you're so invested in it to know.
It is.
You want to share different things with the audience, and to be told it's not necessary. So.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure you've had these chats with your other authors. We all have to be very mercenary, and certain scenes get deleted.
Mm-hmm.
But as I tell my writing students, they'll always live on in your laptop. So
that's right. And maybe they'll pop up somewhere else. Who knows?
Yes, you never know. And you're the better for it, for writing them.
Do you ever, like for your email list or something like that, do like secret scenes or something like that?
Ooh, that's a good point. No, I've never done that.
That might be kind of
I
fun.
I think so. I do little Easter eggs that for the longest time no one but me would notice, but I think now more people notice. So, for example, in this third book, which is again nothing to do with the stationery shop or Together Tea, I do toward the end have the character go to a stationery shop and buy something from a Mr. Thackeray, right? So
Okay.
readers will now know that. And something else I did between the first and second books is the housekeeper is the same,
Oh,
but I'm pretty sure no one but me noticed that. So,
okay. That's kind of fun though. That's neat. So
Yeah.
now people are going to be like, ooh, I
yeah,
need to go,
yeah, just fun
need to go
things
pay
like
attention
that.
to that.
Yeah, yeah.
That's fun. I like that. Okay. Huh. So what authors do you read?
Oh gosh, there's so many authors I read. So as you know, I feel like the cake was baked with those classics that I read as a
Yeah.
kid. And sometimes I feel the books you read as a child almost inform your style the most because
Yeah.
they are part of your DNA. But now I read a lot of contemporary fiction. And when I moved to the US, I was guided by great teachers, English teachers in middle school and high school who told me all about contemporary American writers. And I was introduced to
Nice.
people like Toni Morrison. And I love Anne Patchett.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to
Yeah.
read whatever I can of hers. And there's just a great crop of new writers out there like Mary Beth Keane. I love her Ask Again, Yes. It's a beautiful book.
Nice.
And I get sent a lot of books that haven't been published
Mhm.
in order to blurb them.
Right. Yeah.
So it's exciting because you get to see what's coming
What's
out.
coming up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
fun. That's a gift to be able to take a peek at some new stuff and new authors, and that's
Yeah.
exciting.
It's nice because it's people no one's heard of yet.
Exactly. And if you can help introduce them, that's always pretty exciting. So that's
I
neat.
definitely try to help them because I remember when my first book was being published, Eleanor Lippman agreed to read the galley copy,
Okay.
before it came out in order to blurb it. And
Nice.
she blurbed it and she didn't have to do that. But
That's
she
makes a
did.
difference, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes. So
That's
I'm
very
always so
cool.
grateful. Yeah.
Yeah. Alina had asked if you speak Farsi.
Mhm.
Okay.
I
And
do. Yeah, I speak it.
okay. Yeah, and I assume, that's probably what you grew up with, potentially that in English and
Yeah, so because I didn't really live there, again, between ages 2 and 5 and 9 to almost 11, but in our house, wherever we were, my parents spoke Farsi to us.
okay.
So I grew up speaking Persian to them, and to this day, I speak it to them.
Okay.
But what was funny is my sister and I spoke English to each other. So
That's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, we were always speaking both. So, at the dinner table, mother would say, pass the salt in Persian to me. And I would respond in Persian to her, but then I would speak in English to my sister. That's to this day how it is.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And do your children speak Farsi or Persian?
So I have 2 children, and they obviously were born and raised in the US,
Yeah.
except for that little Australia part. But my daughter speaks it.
Okay.
It's a miracle of God because Lord knows we didn't speak it to her, sadly.
That's cool. What a gift, though, for her to have that.
She pursued it.
That's cool.
Pursued it herself. And when she was little, we took her on Saturday mornings to the Persian language classes in Boston, and she had the desire, and so she speaks it.
Okay.
Writes it, but my son doesn't. Isn't that strange?
Nicole lives in Norway, and she said that in her household it's Dutch, Norwegian, and English.
Yeah, I believe it.
Did you learn to speak any of the other languages as you traveled? Or, I mean, there's a lot of English speaking ones in there, but
Yeah, so I learned to speak German when I was in Germany, and then I sort of got into it when we were in Switzerland, because I lived in
okay.
the German part of Switzerland, German speaking part, and used to be fluent in German. Now I'm forgetting so much of it. And I
You
was
don't
fluent.
use it, you lose it, don't you?
You lose, yeah, exactly. I've lost so much. I used to be also fluent in French just because that's what I studied at school.
Okay.
And I used, a lot of Iranians, their second language that they learned in school was French, not English.
Okay.
Up until a certain time, I would say maybe up until like the 60s. So my grandparents and my parents learned French in school, not English.
Okay.
But that too is being lost. So
yeah,
that.
times change, huh? Jeez. Very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in, everybody. Thank you, Becky, for your great questions.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. It's been a treat to talk with you. So how can people stay in touch with you? What's the best ways to find you?
Yes. Oh gosh, please, if you wish, you can find me on Instagram.
Awesome. Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good rest of your day, ladies.
Thanks for joining me today on the Literary Escape podcast. If you enjoy hearing the behind the book story, then join me in the Literary Escape Society. We're a community of travelers who love books, or maybe book lovers who love to travel. Either way, if you need an escape, a literary escape, come join us as we read our way around the world together, one book at a time. Check out the show notes to learn more about the Literary Escape Society. And we'll see you next time on the next episode.